So the book, we have here the book that was published in 1946. It was published and now it's been recently reissued by a Korean publisher who's also issued this book all in Korean. Now this was about Elizabeth Keith. Elizabeth Keith lived from about 1885, I think, through to 1956. She travelled around all of Asia, but particularly to Korea. She illustrated this book with her watercolours and drawings, or some drawings, and the text was by her sister. So she went to Korea with her sister, and her sister has written all the text. And the sister was very much concerned. The sister only went there for 3 months in 1919. And 1919 was the time of the Song Young-dal movement. And that's, you can see that's what's happening here, the independence movement. So if you think in Korea, Korea was occupied by the Japanese from 1910 to 1945. In 1919, the Koreans, 33 very important Korean leaders, arranged a declaration of independence, and everybody in the country, or particularly students, took up and took to the streets to object. And this was the independence movement. So this occurs quite a lot in the book. And the book talks too about how the two sisters travelled around and they were aware of the Japanese presence that comes there. And this one, then, when this came out in 1946, after that there'd been some Korean editions, the most recent of which was this one. And both of these have come out in 2020, copy of the original 1946 one and this one. This one's been put together, compiled by Professor Song, a Korean expert who now lives in America. And he's compiled all the prints and watercolours and everything that Elizabeth Keith produced. He's put it all together in this one book, which is very, marvellous. So together, the two work as a pair. And of course, the only problem is people like me can't read the Korean. It's got lots of pictures about what Elizabeth Keith saw and how people dressed in that time. So these are a couple of the illustrations from the book. And you can see when she set out in her introduction, she says these sketches were made during various visits. So she went back to Korea several times. She got all sorts of watercolours and sketches together. And then when it came to publish the book, she chose what she wanted from her various trips to Korea. And then, as she explains, through the medium of these pictures, I have tried to give glimpses of the dress, homes, customs, and general culture of the Korean people. So she's very meticulous, she's very careful, very involved in capturing all the details. This is one page, the domestic interior with all the decorations. You can see the furniture and the calligraphy and the paper sliding doors, all of this, and the man having his dinner. And in this illustration on the left, it's embroidering, and we come through, as we go through the talk, you'll see just how important embroidery is in terms of the Korean cultural aesthetic.
One of the things that really struck me, Jackie, reading the book, is that both the illustrations of Elizabeth Keith and her sister writing is just so bringing to life the situations that they're in, the detail of description that she gives of an interior setting like this, or of the interior of a small sort of local restaurant. She talks about the cracked bowl, she talks about the rats that run across the back window ledge, she talks about the broken paper screen that allows a breath of the cold sort of wind coming through. She talks about sort of every detail of the chopsticks, the ceramics on the table. It really just has this amazing, it brings an aroma of the situation. So there are certain flaws of the foreigner making sort of exotic observation, which is sort of really part of what they were at the time. But just the length of description, and I think that's one of the reasons why Elizabeth Keith and her sister have become very popular or researched in Korea today, because they're sort of one of these sort of accounts of early 20th century Korea, which is so specific and accurate to detail.
Yes, gives great detail about it, yes. And this elaborate belt. And so just to look at the detail she captured and to see what the costume was that the Confucian scholars would wear at this time when she was there, we have here this scholar, and he has a crane, and this is an example of the sort of insignia. These were very important, these rank badges as they are called, that they would wear on the front of their costumes. Birds were for civilian ranks, and there are whole different, there are 1 to 9 ranks, depending on when you fit it into different ranks, and the military wore animal birds. So we have here, and then you know, in the book they talk about the 2 sisters visit the nobleman, and they saw the screen behind. The interior had simplicity and dignity. So they responded to what is this aesthetic of Korean interiors. So often we have the wood and the paper and the furniture and seated on the floor. And then the boys entertained us by putting on the father's old official clothes. They were made of brocades, wonderful silks, and one, a scholar's black silk gown, had a Chinese blue lining, and there were strange breastplates of Korean silk embroidery. So she's captured it without fully understanding the significance of these badges, but they're very important in the society of the day. This is another example of the dress, how significant the dress is, and this is one of the belts they wear, and as she says here, this is what the overdress is worn above a blue robe, and there is a small bag, white jade beads. The belt is not supposed to fit the waist, but stands out in a big circle. It's made of tortoiseshell and leather.
So the sort of simple minimalist aesthetic, which really leads to one of the most sort of iconic symbols of Korea and sort of one of the most appreciated forms of ceramics, and that's the Korean moon jar, which fortunately is something that I've pursued for several years, and we've managed to purchase one. And there was a magnificent exhibition that many of you would have seen here during the COVID period last year of a Korean photographer who had travelled the world finding moon jars in overseas collections, photographing them and really bringing them back together in this in an exhibition, which is the only way that all of these sort of magnificent symbols of simplicity and modesty that represent sort of the Korean aesthetic and personality, and he brought them together for the exhibition here. Quite unbeknown to the planning for the exhibition here, I've been working on really trying to acquire a moon jar for an Australian collection, and both of them came together really at the same time, and we're fortunate at the NGV to be able to secure this piece with quite a rigorous application to the Korean Cultural Authority for export permission to bring it to Australia. And because there wasn't one in an Australian collection to this point, they were very interested to have one in an Australian cultural institution. So really a great example of this reserved aesthetic, which of course is very symbolic of the personality of the Korean scholars that we've been looking at. If we go back to some of the Elizabeth Keith prints, Woodwork Prince produced from her sketches, probably her most famous image that we have a little image of over there. That's about the size of the print itself. Here's the 2 children at New Year's time in their traditional costume. This was in a suitcase of a family that rang me up about 2 years ago. They had received a suitcase of personal effects from their aunt who had died about 20 years prior to that. They didn't know what to do with it. They were just about to throw it all out. Luckily, they did sort of call me to see if anything of value was in it, and there was a lot of manuscripts written by this Korean missionary who was there in the 1950s that were never published, several other personal effects, and this particular print. Elizabeth Keith prints were something that were collected by the missionaries, including the Australian and other sort of nationality missionaries that were there. And this had come back into the suitcase, at which time we accepted it into the collection. The other piece shows a Korean bride in the traditional bridal costume, which is another item that I've been fortunate enough to find and acquire for the collection at the gallery, which is based on the colour theory, the Chinese colour theory, with green representing wood, yellow earth, pink fire, white metal, blue water, the colour theory of nature association. And these were used in wedding. That's a wedding sort of outfit with an overcoat. And it's believed that the combination of the colours would, these auspicious colours, have the power to ward off evil spirits at the time of a wedding. And we see this traditional Korean colour palette, or this very sort of folk Korean colour palette of these, the colour theory, the nature sort of colour theory, colour palette, really starting to be employed or really influencing the practice of Keith's paintings and prints. And you can see this in a very subtle way. It's the work here of the Korean marriage procession through Seoul. You see the palanquin being carried. There's the tiger's pelt, which was the traditional thing, again, to protect the bride as she was being taken in the palanquin to her new home across the bridge in Seoul. Though most of you would have been to Seoul, and one of the things that I love there is those granite mountains that surround the city, and you can sort of look out your hotel room and see these wonderful sort of big bold mountains that dot up throughout the city, very evident in Keith's print here. But the colours which I'm talking about in this print and other prints that she's using is really coming from that traditional folk craft colour aesthetic, which goes on for me to introduce this other group of beautiful Korean wedding pillows that we also purchased for the collections about 2 years ago, with auspicious symbols, the peony, the lotus flower again coming up. It's interesting that these were a very traditional gift which were given to with auspicious symbols given to bride and groom to take to their new home. And the shapes of the pillows and the designs differ within the different regions of Korea, with these small sort of oblong ones at the top, and you see several in that shape from the region around Seoul. The square one that's done from woven reeds, with colour dyed woven reeds from the southeastern sort of provinces, the coastal regions in the southeast of Korea. And then the big square and round ones are from the north, which would be current day North Korea, a style that was produced there. And there is the square ones were for a man, and the square ones were for, I'm not quite sure which was for which, but the round ones for the use of the man and the woman, and then the other square ones were for the, and I'll just have to sort of re-look that up, which was for which, but I think the round ones might be for the men, which I was quite happy to hear, because they look far more comfortable than the square ones, which may have been used earlier. And then we get to prints by Elizabeth Keith, again this wonderful type of colour palette, which is based on traditional Korean colours. We see these are woodblock prints, and we see this beautiful type of vignette of colour from the rich blue sky that I just sort of love rolling the head from the dark rich blue sky above your head right down at the horizon, where it sort of turns this very sort of light shade of blue on a starry night just after the sun sets. It's been recreated with this wonderful sort of traditional woodblock print technique, and I've read that Elizabeth Keith was so strict when her prints were being made in Tokyo with the...
That's a woodblock?
That's a woodblock print.
Really?
Yes, you couldn't create that type of vignette of colour with a watercolour.
Yeah.
And when the works were being produced using these traditional wood carvers and printers, she was always at hand, getting in the way, sort of instructing how things should be done and this and that, and she was apparently a bit of a stickler for detail in the studio where they were being produced in Tokyo, and then she exhibited them both in Asia and then back in England. Interestingly, these two, Woson, which is in current day North Korea, of course North-South wasn't divided at that time, people would be travelling on the recently established railway networks and various other sort of roads that would go to the base of the Diamond Mountains, etc. This is currently, I don't know if you read, but I'm quite interested to read. This is one of the favourite sort of getaway spots for Kim Jong-un. This is where he has his private train that enters his seaside compound, which has a big beachfront sort of bungalows, and you see up in the hills looking down on the border of Busan. Busan, it's a spelling area, Busan, which is on the east coast, just above the DMZ, about 100 kilometres or so above the DMZ. Jackie, did you? We go on to the next slide.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
So these are just some sort of illustrations at the beginning and the end of each chapter all the way through the book. And we see how Elizabeth Keith, as she goes around, she's absorbing the complexity and the diversity of the pictorial traditions of Korea. And so, for example, down the bottom, the motifs down the bottom are to do with folk art. And you have a tiger, and a tiger is a sort of protective spirit in Korea. And so and a dog is a guardian. So you find, for example, in the homes, we've seen the screens that people have, and we've seen the domestic interior. And so sometimes on the walls of the domestic interior, you would have these figures, which are protective figures, painted on there. And there in the centre is this marvellous mythical sort of Kylan figure. He's sort of a composite figure to do with all various animals, but he's a very auspicious animal too. Up the top, I just took two sort of chapter heading drawings, which are really to show you some of the diversity of the style of painting in Korea. So this sort of painting where you have a scholar, for example, seated under a willow tree with a moon up above and bamboo, this derives from that Confucian heritage, the Confucian Chinese heritage. The bamboo, for example, is a symbol of strength. And so there you have, and the rocks too, this is all very much a Chinese inheritance there. And on your left, you have a sort of representation of a battle scene. And we have to think how, remember too, there are many famous stories to do with the military and famous battles. These sorts of, this sort of style of painting was inherited from the Chinese ink brush painting tradition. Down the bottom, the painting relates more to sort of folk art tradition. And I think this is another book I might just pass around for people, because this is some of the screens we've seen that Wayne has shown, but there are other examples here. So there's sort of screen, Wayne's already shown you some of these sorts of characters, and there are fish too, all these sorts of things. And this folk art painting was done as the Art Gallery New South Wales screen. Many of them were done by itinerant artists, painters who walked around, travelled around the country and asked each home what sort of art they might like, and whether it was for the men's quarters or the women's quarters, and then they might have just the flowers and the birds or the landscape or the marvellous characters, very cursive characters, again combined with flowers, with fish, with all sorts of things of good meaning. And there are plenty of books. And what's very nice too is in some of them you get, because they're quite late, you get spectacles appearing. You can see they're 19th century, people are starting to wearing spectacles. Anyway, you might like to pass this around, because this gives you an example of other types of Korean painting. So you have these sort of Chinese related landscape painting, you have the portraits of all the scholars that we've seen, you have the paintings for walls, you have the screen painting, you have the paintings referencing Confucian morality. There's this enormous variety, which too that Elizabeth Keith is trying to translate into her book. But then when you look, and she says in the beginning of her book, she says, "Oh, I cannot. It's a pity that now the printing is so limited that I cannot translate the full, vibrant colour of that you find in Korea into my book." And she can't. So they've got the reproductive plates capture some of the beauty of the colour of Korea, but not to the same extent, whereas modern photography gives us a better example of the vibrancy, particularly of the Korean folk art tradition.
I think it's interesting, Jackie, with her, and this goes back to the question about the Woodwork Prince. The Woodwork Prince, because of the way that the flat colour could be printed and applied, it starts to give these areas of flat colour which really give them more of that sort of Korean sort of colour type of palette.
That's true, isn't it? Yes.
Whereas her sketches, and the books contain both her sketches and the Woodblock Prince. They're more sort of painterly and sketched, and it doesn't have that intensity of the colour within her drawing. So I think she's obviously sort of instructing on the intensity and style of colours that were being used in the prints.
Yes, and she's picked up on that. And you can see though her prints appear in the Professor Song book that's going around whereas this one are reproductions of her watercolours.
Yeah.
And then some of the, and actually she bemoans the fact that at the back, you see, she could only reproduce some of her watercolours, she could only reproduce them in black and white, and she's saying, you know, what a pity it is. But at the time this book was originally produced in 1946, it was all that she could manage. So then, and also I just thought this is another one, this is one of the black and white monochromes which appears in the book. So we've seen how she looks at the Confucian scholars, she looks at children, she loves children, she looks at marriage processions, and this is one chapter, this is chapter 3, where she's looking at the sorceress. And I just have to read this out to you because you see how descriptive Wayne touched before and how great the description is in the book. And here, part of the description of this one day when the two sisters visited this shaman dancing is here. This is part of it. The sorceress, a woman over 50, with a genial, laughing mouth and clever eyes, presently handed her pipe to the attendant and rose to her feet. She was helped into elegant dancing gowns. The dancer was fat and broadly built, but her feet were small, and their shapely slimness was enhanced by perfectly fitting, thick white cotton, heel-less boots. As the dancer rose slowly, cymbals clashed and one drum beat. The dancer moved with grace, dancing always on the flat of her foot, in time to the beating of the drum, meanwhile chanting in a nasal tone. The aged attendant handed the dancer a little brass rattle with half a dozen bells attached and a large tattered fan, and threw over her left arm a long streamer of yellow silk. Of the musicians, a very small woman beat the largest drum that's there. But you can see there are the bells that she's rattling, and see how carefully documented it all is. And then the feet, the white cotton boots, and all the blind musicians there. And in the background are some women just smoking and completely indifferent to this magic dance that's going on. So it's all, and just on the left is an example of the sort of fan that would have been held there, a shaman's flower fan used when in one of these rituals.
Even the description of that chapter, it goes on to see the woman in the background in the kitchen.
Yes.
She goes into great length about describing the clothes that she's wearing and the smile that she has, and the room full of steam, and the sort of how she's cooking, and so it's not just touching on the activity of the shaman dance. It's going into all of this incredible detail in the setting that she's experiencing.
Yes, what she did do, she did go to the Diamond Mountains. The Diamond Mountains are very famous. Some of you probably all heard of the Diamond Mountains on the eastern side of Korea. And the Diamond Mountains are very important to Buddhism, to Taoism, to shamanism. They have some 12,000 peaks with temples on them, and believed all the spirits are inherited there. So Elizabeth Keith did this very unusual print here of the Diamond Mountains after she travelled there, and it's unusual both for her trying to capture something about some sort of mystical experience she might have had. You can see the figures coming down on the clouds, and then also just with the tigers on the rocks and the dragon. And the tigers and dragons are very extremely auspicious symbols in terms of the whole of the Korean mythology. And Professor Sung, in his book, he writes about this work. This work left a big impression because it is not easy for Western women who do not speak Korean to look around the Diamond Mountains where roads are not properly constructed. Keith left a long journal entry in the window of the Orient. When it rained, the stream swelled fiercely, hence I was afraid. But it was mysterious when I came down to the foggy valley with the fresh wind after the rain. And perhaps the reason Keith, who enjoys realistic painting, put fantasy scenes in her paintings about the Gungan is because she felt the atmosphere of the temple in the mountain and the scenery so mysterious. And I must say, if some of you have been to the Diamond Mountains, if you go to these temples, you feel this, you do feel the surrounding other spiritual atmosphere. It really is there that you feel, you become conscious of these things, metaphysical concerns, things beyond the actual world of nature that we know. It's quite a remarkable experience, and I think it's a tribute to her that she tried to capture this other extended mystical world of Korea in her travels.
It also sort of puts her in the lineage of, the theme of the Diamond Mountains being so important in Korean art. And it's been one of probably the most popular landscape subject of Korean painters over many centuries. There's actually, Jack, I saw behind you on the bookshelf, there's a catalogue of an exhibition just focusing only on the Diamond Mountains that was held at the Met and in Seoul. And I had the lucky chance to see it in Seoul about 2 years ago. It was one of the most sort of incredible exhibitions of these interpretations of these, as the landscape is so dramatic that it really is sort of life-changing for those people who could visit there historically, the artists.
There's quite a few illustrations of Diamond Mountain screens and paintings in that book that's going around, and you can get the feel of how this dramatic it is. And I think if you were a Western woman in the 1920s going up these steep mountains on your...
Well, I actually heard a few stories that she was piggybacked around a little
Oh,
bit.
dear.
So she was doing a little bit in the traditional sort of, missionary style of travel. But certainly to get out to these locations as an artist and to sit and to paint. But her works are included in the catalogue and the show at the Met and the National Museum in Seoul as really part of this tradition of interpreting this sort of spiritual, life-changing experience that scholars and artists had when they visited, this one of the most sort of iconic, famed locations. Unfortunately, just over the border nowadays, and it's you can't really get there.
No, you can't. And you can see the dragon. The dragon, of course, is like the symbol of the masculine, the sun, and then in the Chinese system you've got the yang, which is the dragon, and the yin, which is the female. So you've got all this other language going on too, this philosophical language. So and the power of the water. Anyway, it's a great tribute to her that she tries, and we see how impressed she was with all aspects of Korean society, the people, the way their manners, their costumes, and their religions and philosophy too. So that's, thank you. That's it.
Will we throw it open if there's any questions?